If you've ever studied history, you know that one day 2024 will be in the interwar year section. You also know that armies rarely, if ever, actually predict whatever the next war is going to look like correctly. You would think that with the DoD spending trillions on aircraft carriers, satellites, and shelf-stable pizza, we would have had the foresight to hire a psychic by now. Are we bad guessers, or is it actually just harder to predict what wars are going to look like in the future than I thought? I teamed up with TikTok beekeeper and defense analyst Preston Stewart to help get some clarity and see if he has the military-industrial crystal ball so I know which defense contractors to invest in. Before I start making unqualified ramblings, I want to preface this by saying war is complicated, like really, really complicated. I would argue with some level of confidence that fighting a large-scale war is the most complicated things humans actively perform. More than putting a man on the moon or building the pyramids, there's a reason that it leads to nations having to completely reorganize their entire economies, populations, and industries just to support it. History is largely driven by who wins a war, so it's usually in your best interest to at least make an educated guess. And boy do we, with DARPA, Army Futures Command, the Warfighting Lab, Instagram, schizophrenics, the list goes on and on. So why are we still not getting it right? Also, second preface before I get started, Preston said this.
My only ask is that you edit the video in a way that makes me younger and more attractive than I am.
And I barely know how to turn on my computer. So what you're seeing is the best I could come up with. Now, because Ukraine is the first large-scale war between two roughly equal sides using modern military equipment, everyone has their eyes on it. And they're trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work, and how to leverage that information to benefit our own military. Back in the day, these kinds of ideas for how to improve warfighting were largely relegated to dry studies carried out by research professionals, or at the very least, people with experience in the military. But now, you got Bubba and Terry who watched a video that was labeled as being from Ukraine, but it was actually just ARMA gameplay, and now they're experts in how armies should fight. I am not here to say that the democratization of military analysis is a bad thing. Gatekeeping the idea that drones are scary is not on my to-do list today. But all the info, good, bad, unreliable, reliable, all leads people to make political decisions that eventually have actual implications on a battlefield somewhere. And long-form analytic works tend to not go viral like drone footage overlay with Bring Me the Horizon playing. I want to take this video as kind of a pause in discourse to see what the good ideas are, what the bad ideas are, where they're coming from, and where we're going. So first, why is it so hard to predict the future of warfighting? Just looking at things like the fact that we invaded Iraq wearing forest camo, the Potomac Army, and more failed prototypes of light tanks than Edison had of the first light bulb show that we're willing to spend billions on ideas that end up not working out so well.
So the reason I think it's so hard to predict where warfare is going is because you have lives on the line. And it sounds kind of crazy, but we can sit here and think about all the different ways that a conflict might play out with any sort of adversary, near peer or otherwise. But the minute that somebody is on the verge of getting killed, unless they figure something out, all bets are out the window, right? And I think we're going to get into this more in some of these later questions, but that's what we're seeing with some of the innovation in Ukraine. Things that we didn't really consider were on the table, like the explosion of drones across the battlefield from off-the-shelf, types. We didn't really see that coming, but when somebody's life and their country is on the line, you see changes come about that were maybe very, very hard to predict, before the conflict started.
Troops have a knack of adapting to the situations as it happens. In the early days of the Iraq War, we rolled around in soft-skin Humvees like it was no problem. Then suddenly you have scathing reports of soldiers having to weld their own armor plating onto them. This was then exploited by insurgents using IEDs like they were going out of fashion, which then led to the development of all the MRAP variants we see today. We failed to identify the lack of Humvee armor as a legitimate need across the whole force, and once that was fixed, other means were found to take them out by the enemy. And then suddenly we have another massive issue on our hands, and we have to rely on new technology to help mitigate it, and then the cycle just repeats itself. Before I get a novel-length comment, yes, there were armor packages for the Humvees back in 2003, but there weren't enough to go around. Humvees were designed to be support vehicles, not pseudo-APCs, and these kinds of mistakes are fairly common. We have an idea of what the future will be, but we're off just enough to be wrong. Drones existed well before the breakout of the war in 2022, but the majority of them were either giant unmanned planes or specially designed ones from defense contractors and therefore expensive and harder to maintain or replace, meaning not everyone had them. If you're one of the poorest countries in Europe and have a need for drones in excess of what's realistically available in the defense market, you're gonna find a way way around that. If you're suddenly on the receiving end of said drone, you're going to need to find a way around that too. It's the same cycle as before. And yes, we have always known that drones were going to be a big deal. We've been trying to figure out how to take drones down since like 2015. I remember back in 2017 being handed this weird mesh Frankenstein piece of plastic and wires that was designed to interrupt the signal of drones. But so far, none of these older ideas have had the effect needed on a battlefield. So now you see hard kill systems and duck hunting shotguns falling into more favor compared to something that looks like it belongs in Halo. Just because we knew something was going to be important didn't mean we had the right answer for it at the time.
I think a great example of that is battleships following World War I. During and then shortly after the First World War, you saw countries around the world start to build up, bigger ships with more bigger guns. That was the future of naval warfare. It was going to be how the world was conquered, if you will, in a sense. And what we saw from, very early, especially, with Pearl Harbor, when the United States was pulled into the war, turns out aircraft carriers were actually the very, very important thing that are still widely used today. And if you look at, how that naval warfare is played out, nobody is building the biggest ships with the biggest guns anymore. It's all about aircraft carriers. So I think that's a good example of where we thought warfare was headed and then just completely missed it.
Now, everyone knows that the US just finished fighting a 20-year low-intensity coin operation in the Middle East, which if you look at how we trained and organized ourselves was not what we were expecting back in the early 2000s necessarily. One big question that oftentimes people ask is if those 20 years actually did anything to prepare us for an actual war against a conventional force. Coin and hybrid warfare operate on completely different rules and at an intensity that pales in comparison to what we see in Ukraine or what we'd see in the South China Sea. Take the JLTV, for example, the high-tech replacement for the Humvee. Now, I'll be the first to say that A, they look cooler, B, they feel like riding in a spaceship while you're in them, and most importantly, C, comes standard with cup holders and air conditioning that would even freeze out that one kid in your junior high class that wore shorts outside when it snowed. This was built with lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan. They're much better suited to handle explosions and small arms fire, but have less interior space and physical cargo area. They're significantly larger, meaning they're bigger targets, mechanically and electronically complex, and Lord help you if the hydraulics shit the bed on you because they're a bitch and a half to fix. Spoiler alert. The hydraulics are going to shit out on you. Yes, it can handle rough terrain better. It has much better integration of communications equipment and higher survivability, but all these come with trade-offs. It's a shift in pros and cons from the older model, and we don't know if those pros and cons will hold up if we go toe-to-toe with a near-peer adversary.
So my take is that it was an overall benefit. Not that the goal, of course, was to prepare for a large-scale war, but I think the experiences gained in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, really around the world were really better than nothing. First off, I want to say let's separate out combat from combat support in this sense. On the combat side, there's something to be gained there, right? I don't want to write it off entirely. There is something to having leaders who have been shot at before move up through the ranks of our military. But of course, the type of combat experienced across the board in Iraq and Afghanistan is very, very different, with maybe the exception of the first 3 to 4 weeks in Iraq. Very, very different than what we would experience in a peer or near peer fight. However, it's something. The other side, and where I think we actually gained a lot of positive lessons here, was in the logistics and sustainment front, right? So the ability to set up and maintain a force forward in Afghanistan for 20 years. Like, that took a lot of work if you think about all of the things that we got into that country and were able to move in relatively quickly. The medical aspect, being able to forward deploy medical assets to treat soldiers very, very quickly as they came off the battlefield, that expeditionary type medicine. All of that is very, very hard to plan, predict, and train outside of a combat zone. And we had, depending on the theater, 10, 20 plus years practicing that kind of stuff, getting troops ready for deployment, sending them overseas, all of that. We've now had the ability to practice it a little bit. I think overall, it's a net benefit.
Now, there are countless, and I mean countless, little things that you can take away from watching the war in Ukraine, but I want to focus on the 3 things that people have been talking about the most. Those being the extensive use of drones, the idea that tanks are obsolete now, and artillery reigning supreme as the end-all be-all of future warfare. We'll start our discussion with drones. Like I said earlier, these are nothing new, and they've completely changed maneuvering on the battlefield. We've all seen the videos of FPVs converting tanks into pieces of a tank, and countless grenades dropped onto onto helpless infantry formations. The thing is, though, that while these inhibit your enemy's ability to operate and take a few of them out for you, they're not going to win the war, especially if both sides are using them to equal effects. I'll be the last person to say that psychologically being able to give your enemy PTSD from the sound of a mosquito flying by is not useful, but I think the wrong lesson to take away is that they can do anything and achieve any military objective.
The biggest one for me right now is that drones are everywhere, and it's something that has to be integrated down to the lowest level. Drones at the squad level, maybe even team level, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. If we're not putting drones some sort of it doesn't have to be strike capability. If we're not putting some sort of ISR capability down at the squad level, we're putting our soldiers at a direct disadvantage to their adversary and kind of setting them up for failure on the battlefield. That's not how we operated in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not how we tend to operate today, but we have to recognize that our adversaries are going to have, those types of eyes over the battlefield down at the squad team level. If we don't, that's a problem for our guys.
The real game-changing aspect of small, cheap drones is that they've effectively made the battlefield transparent. You simply cannot go from point A to point B without being seen by an enemy drone flying overhead. It's the intelligence capability that these bring that are the real game changer. Tying into that is the idea that tanks and cheap ATGMs have made the tank virtually obsolete. But it's worth mentioning that things like FPV drones are so effective because anytime you bring a new system onto the battlefield and it works effectively, it's only going to work effectively for as long as someone doesn't figure out how to counter it. And that's been the rule of thumb since someone figured out you don't gotta hit someone with a rock, you can throw it and have the same effect. It's basically free internet points these days if you claim that we're watching the death of the tank. But here's the thing though, this is a classic case of mistaking vulnerabilities for capabilities. Vulnerabilities are what you can hurt on something, but capabilities are what you're able to do with that piece of equipment. You don't remove something from the battlefield unless you have something better that can replace it, or at the very least what it was able to do. I might be vulnerable to cyberbullying, but I have yet to find someone with the capability of posting such pseudo-schizophrenic brunch pictures as I have, so I'm gonna keep doing it. Yes, tanks are vulnerable to drones and cheap ATGMs, but javelins and a DJI Maverick with a grenade duct taped to it aren't gonna do the things that a tank can do. Yes, tanks are more vulnerable than ever, and cope cages are ugly as hell, but right now that's what we have. Experimental tank designs are including things like electronic warfare jammers integrated to handle drones, and in some cases, the drones are integrated into the design itself. Right now, I don't see a future where we don't have tanks, simply because we don't have something that can do what a tank can do without having those vulnerabilities. I don't know what the future thing would look like, but hopefully it's like mech suits and power armor, because that shit's dope. Now, the last thing is that artillery is now the deciding factor of which side wins in a given battle. Half of the discussion around supplies to Ukraine and Russia regard artillery shells, how many they can get to the front, and how many replacements of artillery guns they can bring to the fight. There is zero denying that this has been a critical component of both sides' strategies, and it's already causing changes in artillery strategy in the United States. But are people looking at it the wrong way?
All right, this is a hot take, so bear with me. I think one of the wrong lessons coming out of this war is that we need to overhaul our artillery shell production. There's been so much focus for a couple years now about how Russia's outproducing the United States in terms of artillery ammunition. And that's okay. That's not our focus. We are not an artillery-centric military. If we are and find ourselves in an artillery-centric war with Russia, that means that we failed somewhere else along the line in an area that we generally have a pretty significant advantage, namely air defense or long-range precision munitions. Throughout the war, Russia has forced Ukraine to fight on their terms, this artillery-focused war where Russia has a distinct advantage kind of across the board. It's the same thing here. That is Russia's advantage, is their artillery war, kind of a grinding war of attrition. We don't want to fight that way with Russia or with anyone else. We want them to have to fight on our terms, and then we overpower them on our terms. So sure, would it be good to increase artillery ammunition production? Yes, wouldn't be a bad thing to have more ammunition available. But I think rather than playing down to our adversary's strengths and trying to meet them there, the focus should be more on expanding our lead in certain areas so that we don't have to worry about getting into a tit-for-tat artillery war with Russia.
I am inclined to listen to him because Preston has artillery officer listed on his LinkedIn 3 times. Now, there are generally 2 ways you can adapt your army. One is doctrinal and the other is technologically. Both can be massive headaches and cause company-level leadership to drink at work, but changing doctrine is typically a lot cheaper, and a lot of the times it's all you need to achieve the effects you want.
The safer bet for me when looking at all this is that any changes that would affect how we fight a future war would be at the doctrinal level on how we use these technologies. And that's how we would try to set ourselves apart from, again, China, Russia, and someone else. The biggest issue here, and we've seen China, Russia, even North Korea and Iran to a degree, kind of rolling out technologies that maybe aren't quite the same as what we have in the United States, but it's close enough to kind of erode a significant gap that may have been there in the past. Combined arms warfare is still king. Technology is going to assist with that, of course, could make it easier, could make it more lethal, could make it faster. But from the opening days of the war in Ukraine, combined arms warfare is something that we've seen both sides really struggle with. So both Ukraine and Russia have had a very hard time integrating ground forces with artillery, air power, and air defense. It just hasn't hardly happened at all. Now, it's not easy, especially when you're getting shot at and having to try to survive on a modern battlefield. But again, this is something that we've seen both of these forces struggle with significantly from day one, which is one argument as to why the lines haven't shifted a lot really in the last 2 years. Right? Russia's progress is very, very slow, and one of the arguments for that is that they're not able to effectively combine arms to, conduct deep strikes inside of Ukraine, followed up with more precision airstrikes, and then a rolling artillery barrage maybe to hit C2 nodes and resupply points, and then the infantry moves across to seize an objective. We're not seeing that, really hardly at all. It's a very rudimentary approach to combined arms if it's there at all. So maybe a boring answer, if you will, on this one is focusing on those basics of, the average infantry platoon leader being able to talk to air support, the average battalion XO or S3 being able to coordinate air support and air defense and fires, things like that, maybe we take for granted. It's going to be really, really important in any sort of large-scale combat operation.
It goes without saying that nothing Preston just said matters, because no one actually reads doctrine.